Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I've been wondering if the 1969 Kenneth Tynan musical review O Calcutta could comfortably have a sequel called Hello Delhi. Well, thank you for joining me in this episode of Musical Talk, where we're looking again at some of the things you could have seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2024. And this week I'm again in the company of the ever-lovely, ever-insightful Colm Malloy, long-term presenter of Musical Talk and a composer in his own right. And this is the second of 3 episodes where he and I will be chatting about some of the things that caught our eye at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this last summer. Now, our usual position on Musical Talk is to review only shows that we really liked, or which may have been flawed but had a really good idea or a fabulous song or something in it that made it stand out. And we're not actually going to deviate from that today, but we are having a more wide conversation at the beginning of the episode, which I trailed in last week's episode, where Colm and I both saw a number of shows, musical and indeed drama, where there was something that left a bit of a nasty taste in the mouth. Now, we're not going to name any of those shows, that wouldn't be fair, but at the beginning of today's episode you'll hear a conversation that Colm and I had about a trend that we spotted, particularly at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which we didn't like so much, and you'll get to hear why. But we don't want to be negative here on Musical Talk, so we don't dwell on that for too long. Quite soon after that, we move on to a conversation about Crispr, the musical. An American show created, written, performed and produced by Lena Zekas and Dwayne Stanford, who are fabulous performers, about gene editing technology. Of course it is, why would it not be? Here's the blurb for that show. 2 struggling genetics researchers are determined to create the world's first super soya bean, but a rival lab will stop at nothing to defeat them. Featuring original songs, dance, action-packed battles and shocking twists, Crispr, the musical, is a high-energy romp that will knock your socks off. Which was a terribly funny and clever show in many ways, and more than anything had the most amazing stagecraft. Because Lena and Dwayne are the only actors in it, and goodness me, they play an enormous number of characters almost simultaneously. And yet there is a question about whether the musical is really about gene editing at all, and we'll be talking about that later in the programme. And then after that, Colm and I will be revisiting 2 shows which I discussed previously with Michael Gordon Shapiro, also a regular here on Musical Talk, also a noted composer in his own right. I actually think it's really rather interesting to hear conversations between different people about the same shows. So on this occasion, the 2 shows that we're going to hear towards the end of the programme will be the Jaffa Cake Musical by Giggle Mug, which, if you remember rightly, is a musical set in a courtroom with all the constraints but also opportunities that that offers, about the famous landmark tax case, I'm not making this up, about Jaffa Cakes, which is a British cake or biscuit, and that indeed is what the legal case and then ultimate musical was all about. Is a Jaffa Cake a biscuit or a cake? Jaffa Cake the Musical will help unravel that problem for you in a delightful and sweet way. So Colm and I will be talking about that. And there's also 2 songs from that show, which I'm delighted to be able to share with you. And then finally, we'll finish the episode revisiting the Wellbrick Centre on Roswell Drive, which you may remember that Mike and I saw and discussed a few weeks ago, which is ostensibly about 2 people who are having to use mental health services in Scotland, who have very different journeys and experiences. And then, as the story unfolds, you realise that the question is not quite what is the narrative going on here, but more whose story is this and are they a reliable witness? It's a show that unfolds but also collapses around you, and you have to make something of it. So 3 very different shows here today: Crispr, the Jaffa Cake Musical and the Wellbrick Centre on Roswell Drive. In a minute, we'll hear a wonderful song from Jaffa Cake the Musical. Then we'll go into that discussion about that unusual and slightly disturbing trend that Colm and I observed at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. A quick discussion about Crispr, the musical. Then a second song from Jaffa Cake, followed by the discussion about Jaffa Cake, followed by a song from the Wellbrick Centre on Roswell Drive, plus the appropriate conversation with Colm about that show, and then we'll finish off with another song. 4 songs, 3 musicals, 4 subjects. Write that down. That's today's checklist. If you get to the end of the episode and you've marked a cross against all of those items, you've probably finished the episode. Well done. But as we're still at the beginning, let's start you off on that journey with a song from Jaffa Cake the Musical.
By mistake, many times I've left food out in the open. I'd say that's the real crime, so put me in handcuffs. Objection, if I'm disbarred, remember these words I've spoken. A cake goes hard, but a biscuit goes soft. Is he gonna be hard or soft? Hard or soft? It's all okay, our lucky day. Is he hard or soft? We put this to the test and left out a plate of Jaffas. When they'd gone past their best, I took a little bite. I almost chipped a tooth, so let it be known hereafter. We speak the truth and the defense is right. Is he gonna be hard or soft? Hard or soft? I think this may be Judgment Day. Is he hard or soft? Iron Lady Justice with her kitchen scales. People all entrust us to be fair, but judges are just humans wearing frilly wigs. I will rock my costume and my hair, this I swear. Is he gonna be hard or soft? Hard or soft? It's all okay, our lucky day. Is he hard or soft? Is he gonna be hard or soft? Hard or soft? I think this may be Judgment Day. Is he hard or soft?
We've discussed 2 or 3 shows already, and we're going to discuss a few more, but you and I were both struck, I think, by some trends in storytelling in particular, rather than music, more storytelling that we saw both in musicals that we saw this year and actually in 1 or 2 of the dramas or comedy dramas that we saw as well in our schedule, because a man cannot live by bread alone. And we weren't delighted by some of the trends in this year's storytelling.
No, I think also on the whole, for me, this Fringe hasn't been as strong as last year. But that's also, I should also prefix that by saying that I saw 30 shows. You saw maybe double that, and yet there are 3,000 shows on. So I saw 1% of all shows. Yeah. So there's no possible way that I can actually definitively say that it was an unsuccessful year. With that in mind, of the shows that I did see, I definitely felt there was a leaning towards what I'm going to call amorality as either a subject matter or as a means to an end, or glorifying actually questionable people, if I may say. That was a big thing I noticed. Maybe I'm going to say 3 or 4 of the shows we saw shared that in common, which left me feeling really confused on the good end, a little bit more than annoyed at the other end of the spectrum. What did you think?
Oh no, unfortunately I agree with you entirely. And it's interesting because I think you quite nicely delineated the issue, which is actually, it was the amorality was being used and in some cases proper immorality, but it was being used quite often to highlight bad behaviour in somebody or people. But then the story would go on to not just vilify them in some way, and very rarely to try and educate them or bring them round to a better way of thinking or living, but but actually to sort of punish them. The thing I didn't like most this year was I saw a number of pieces where actual violence was handed out to people who had questionable moral positions. And the one that came up the most, so I'm picking this one just as an example, was there were a lot of shows that I saw where there was a very, I would say, ridiculously over-the-top misogynistic character. Much more misogynistic than, really quite to the point where you think, well, these people are on the fringes of society anyway. These are not mainstream people who might have misogyny. They were painted in a very black and white kind of a way, not much complexity. And obviously, as a modern 21st century audience member, you're going to say, yes, these people have views which I don't chime with me, and therefore I'm concerned about. But then the other characters would, in a number of pieces, create situations where that person was physically harmed or came to a sticky end. And you actually think, well, hang on, what's the moral position here? Because I would argue that physical violence is worse. I must say it. I didn't see much moral high ground being retained by the characters you thought might have got or had the moral high ground in a piece when some of the characters were quite so black and whitely painted. Now, then, of course, you're saying, well, actually, what they've done there has been much more complex. And it is possible to argue that it is that question about if someone is bad, but then you do bad things to them, do you have the moral high ground, is the point of the piece. I'd like to say I agree with that, but I'm afraid in some of the pieces I don't think that was the case. What I saw was a lot of narrative punishments being doled out to people with whom the playwright didn't like their particular stance on something. But sometimes that the ultimate victim, i.e. the person who has the questionable moral or morality, shall we say, was not sufficiently complex or thought through to be anything other than a cipher.
Sure. Or I think, if I may say, in an even worse case, victims who had no questionable points of view, who were just kind of set up and killed.
Oh, well,
and violence thrust upon them in a way. I think that's even worse, because then I'm really stuck with what are we doing here?
Yes. There's a particular show which we're not going to name, I think, but yes, you're right, where a victim was identified for insurance purposes.
Yeah.
And the rest of the piece was, I think, supposed to be a serious but possibly comic drama about bumping them off.
I think more comic.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure, again, I was thinking a lot about it afterwards, and I don't think as an audience we always have to be on the side of what's morally correct. I mean, Sweeney Todd is a successful musical for a reason, and we all sympathise with Sweeney. I think we all even empathise to a degree, yeah. But there's something in the mechanics of that show that makes it work. I don't quite know what it is. I'm sure if we had time we could delve into it.
Also, he doesn't get redeemed.
He doesn't get redeemed. Sure.
In some cases, a lot of these people got away scot-free.
Take your point, yeah.
There wasn't as much complexity put into some of the thinking behind these stories as others. I shouldn't say, I think we need to temper this to a degree, that not all the shows were like this, but there was certainly some we saw. And there is a show that we can talk about, because actually it was very popular. It just missed the mark for me, and I think for you, which was called Crispr the Musical, which was a phenomenal piece of stagecraft in the sense it was just two actors doing the whole cast. And it was advertised as being, at last, the gene editing musical you've all been waiting for. And my expectation was I was going to get an entertaining musical talking about, but a sort of documentary musical talking about how gene editing has come in over the years and what it offers up. I expected to learn something. Didn't get that at all. What we got was a very charismatic acting couple, a man and a woman, who then played all the characters really quite impressively and delineated them beautifully. But it actually got bogged down very quickly in inter-university departmental rivalry and politics, to the point where actual experiments were being closed down for political reasons and scores were being settled. And then we got the arrival of the conspiracy theorists, and then the end was a bit of a runaround where various combinations of these people were literally running around a university building trying to save or destroy various experiments. Whilst I'm sure there are people in the world who do get engaged in university politics and do down their rivals at the expense of science, and I'm sure, well, we all know there are conspiracy theorists. So at that level I can see where its roots were. there is a question in this musical about what it was about and what it was trying to do. It sort of said, actually, we just want to be a romp with the background of gene editing, with a tiny bit about soybean production in difficult environments.
Yeah, I think perhaps it's fair to say that the show didn't necessarily know what it was aiming at in terms of, it's not really about Crispr, it's about
at all.
It's about people with bad intentions, which and you can have that title for free, Bad Intentions, or I think ultimately a show's title should reflect what it's about.
Agreed. Which we've spoken about already, but also making sure that it's got enough punch so that people understand there's something going on. Don't get me wrong, I am 100% willing to say that I didn't get much out of it, but everyone else in the audience did. I think you heard someone say that's the best show I've seen in Edinburgh this year, hands down.
I think it's a 10 out of 10 as well.
There you are. So I'm fully aware that I'm taking a particular
different reviewing system to one you're familiar with, I think.
It is indeed, yes, fine. And I really like the vivacity on stage, and I really like the characterisation on stage, and I thought the stagecraft, they made a limited set go a very long way. What I wasn't expecting and therefore felt disappointed by was getting a fantastical runaround rather than something a bit more based on what appeared to me to be what it was advertising, which is a show about gene editing, which ironically I would be very interested in seeing. I think that musical is yet to happen.
Half moon, crescent, total eclipse, eat it how you like once it touches your lips. How do you two eat them? Chocolate first? I nibble round the edge. Oh, you're well versed. 520 ways to do it. Doesn't matter to me how you choose to chew it. What I want to do is establish the fact that we all use our fingers to enjoy this snack. Kevin, what's her plan? Keep it cool, my man. It's time for some real talk. If a Jaffa cake's a cake, why don't you eat it with a fork? Whoa, fork, 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 fork. If a Jaffa cake's a cake, why don't you eat it with a fork? In fact, way back, a robber was caught. He went under oath in this very same court. How'd they catch him and match him? Do you know, Jake? They found his fingerprints on a Jaffa cake. He couldn't resist when he robbed that house. He saw a box of biscuits the owners left out. Did he set out to get out some cutlery? No, he did something he thought subtler, see. Is it frightening you that I'm enlightening you? Do you want to take a little walk? If a Jaffa cake's a cake, why don't you eat it with a fork? Oh, fork, 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 fork. If a Jaffa cake's a cake, why don't we eat it with a fork? Still nothing? We'll see about that. Fork, 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 fork.
It reminds me in a way to the Jaffa Cake musical, in as much that I wasn't quite sure what I was going to expect, what to expect going into it. I know about the is it a cake or is it a biscuit debate and lawsuit.
Yes.
I think I was surprised to see a musical that was just the court case. Personally, I'm not sure how dramatically exciting a musical set in a courtroom is. I think moments of it are allowed. We've got Legally Blonde. We've got, I'm sure there's a courtroom scene.
You're saying is Legally Blonde isn't Legally Bland?
Yes, illegally bland, really. We're not short of courtroom scenes in musicals, or in plays even, for that matter. I think calling a musical Jaffa Cake the Musical, whatever the title is, and then it's a whole musical set in a courtroom is quite an audacious thing to do, if I'm allowed to say that.
You are, completely. And I've had a variant on this conversation with other people for musical talk. So, well, let's talk about that then. Jaffa Cake Musical is one of the big ticket musicals this year, partly because Giggle Mug, the people behind it, now have a pretty solid gold reputation. They did Timpson the Musical, which was terrific. They did Runesicle the Musical a couple of years ago, which was also excellent. Both these shows have had lives after their initial runs. And Giggle Mug's been getting this reputation for being a pretty solid writing company for what might be called the modern day industrial musical. Let's get pretentious.
Yeah, of course.
And in each case of the shows that they've done previously, there has been involvement and support from the companies they're involved in.
I am sorry to interrupt you, but that is... it was a fleeting thought I had when we first started watching Crispr, was that, oh my god, it's being set up like a lecture. It's a musical lecture for people interested in gene editing. I think, oh my god, this is an industrial musical. That wasn't the route it went down at all.
10 minutes later, it was somewhere else.
But for a brief minute, I thought, oh my god, there's so much to talk about regarding industrial musicals with Crispr. And I guess to a degree, Jaffa Cake, if you want. Yeah.
But neither of them take that path.
Yeah.
So here's the question. Musicals can enlighten and entertain and tell stories. We know that. They are still just drama, ultimately. They just happen to have songs as an extra tool in their bag. When you have something as constrained in its format as a court case, and this is essentially the whole court case, we see them preparing for it, we see them doing the prosecution, we see them doing the defence, we hear the judge making a lot of comments, then we hear the ultimate decision and the outcome of that. So those are the stages we see, and that's, exactly as you said, is an absolute staple of drama in particular. Less so musical theatre. As you say, trials come into musicals, but they're really what the musical is about. That constraint can be fabulous, because actually it really forces you to explore it in a 360-degree way and find innovative ways of dealing with it. And then the flip side of that is it too constraining? And also, it's a fairly trammelled way of telling the story. We all know what the stages are going to be more or less in advance. And, of course, this is actually telling a real life story, which for people who don't know is, in the United Kingdom, we have something called the Jaffa Cake, which by common consent is a popular discussion point because it's always sold in the biscuit part of your supermarket, but it's called a cake. And in this country, for reasons which are far too esoteric to describe, they are taxed differently. And therefore, there's a tax advantage to the company that they're cakes and not biscuits. And so it ultimately went to court because the government, the tax department, wanted to tax them as biscuits, and the company was saying no, they're cakes, and then it had to be determined by court because actually the question is almost an irreconcilable one. And to this day now we know the legal definition of a cake and a biscuit. Still doesn't mean that anyone actually believes it necessarily, because I still think of them as biscuits, I'm sorry to say it.
I'm with you there.
And that, if you like, was the selling point of the show. It's a real life case based on that, which is quite interesting because actually it invented the definition of what makes a cake and what makes a biscuit, which is actually how they go stale, I believe. And of course there's famously the big showcase where they cook an enormous Jaffa cake at cake size rather than at biscuit size to show you that it's such a cake. So there's lots of lovely little moments that you sort of have to get in. But I wonder, and I have heard this from other people, if the concept is too constraining, it's too narrow a story to tell under the banner Jaffa Cake the Musical. Now I really liked it, and I thought what they did was fabulous, and I really liked what they were doing within the constraints of a musical, but I 100% accept the idea that it was too narrow. So I've heard I've spoken to a lot of people about it, and there's two schools of thought. Brilliant that they did the musical of this within the constraints they did, and then I've heard far too constrained, far too narrow, legal court cases aren't necessarily very good fodder for musicals, would like to have got a much bigger story. I think that there is truth in both positions. The one thing that saddened me slightly here is that it was much more speech marks truthful to the story, so it was much more fact bound, whereas Timpson was a world of imagination that just happened to be badged as the creation, a completely imagined creation of the Timpson company.
Yeah.
And Runesicle, although it followed some of the concepts of the Runesicle, but you pick your own adventure, they also invented new landscapes and songs. They added new stuff to it to give it a flavour. This felt very much like there's not that much leeway it's being given. Now, we'll never know, I imagine, whether that's because the company themselves who supported this don't want it to be so imaginative or absurdist and do just want to illustrate that story, which is still something people talk about, or whether actually once you're in a court case you can't take it too much further, and therefore the writers wanted to do that.
Yeah,
that's my position on it. I just forgive me. We're talking about the narrative here.
No, if you wanted to go beyond the constraint that you'd set up, I think you'd probably have to do something like in the court proceedings, one of the defence or prosecution had unearthed some centuries-old recipe written by Mr. Jaffa, who's fallen into obscurity, and then that takes us on you want to use the constraint as a means to take you down the garden path. I think, probably.
The Knights of Jaffa would be the obvious place to jump on, surely.
Yeah.
This was the biscuit. This was the comestible that was eaten in the Crusades.
Well, probably, but also back to the courtroom drama aspect of it. St. Joan predominantly takes place with St. Joan on trial, and that's a long play of back and forth of Joan saying one thing and other people saying another thing. So it can be done if you're good enough at writing dialogue for it.
Man for All Seasons also has an enormous court scene where Thomas More is on trial.
And is it also 1776? There's lots of courtroom...
Oh, that's a musical, of course, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, isn't that primarily all in not necessarily a courtroom, but it's pretty boardroom-esque.
Yeah, I don't actually know too much about 1776. There's a great song in it. Yeah. Calm, Intelligent Men is the song I like from that, I think. But.
I guess my point is, I agree with you that I think I can see both sides. I think, I don't know what it needs to do.
More
to
flights
please
of
both.
fancies.
More flights of...
Ironically, I think, because that's what Giggle Mug are known for. I think what I could have done, and it might, if this was a 2-act piece, I might do this myself. I mean, I'm not involved, but if I had been involved, I might have said, actually, let's have some really imaginative, nonsensical, historic scenes where the argument about the Jaffa Cake being a biscuit or a cake is actually being acted out. Now, what we literally get a 5-minute sequence where we see people arguing about it, including the returning fisherman characters who've been in all their previous plays, although spit and a cough in this one. It's identified as being something that causes discord, but actually you could really build that up and have nonsensical, this could be the reason that Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was assassinated in 1812 over a disagreement over the biscuit. It could be the reason for the Battle of Hastings. And you could have fun, and then it all comes down to the only battle that counted was between the taxman and the company. Or you can flash out of the story or use historic precedents in. You can still keep your courtroom story, but actually have as evidence, these stories of these arguments having taken place 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, obviously all made up. But actually it came down to what I suspect is a relatively accurate, although whimsically flavoured, storytelling of the actual court case. We got both. There were 3 reasons given by the prosecution as to why it was really a biscuit, and there were 3 rebuttals by the legal team.
And there was a song for each of those. It was set over 3 days. Again, I wonder if they were thinking constraints first and material second.
Could be. And of course, the thing we're doing there, and it's the kind of thing we were praising Fringe the Musical for at the beginning of the episode, which is not being just another potty. They'd taken all the good parts of being Potty the plant, but decided they were going to have a sincere plot element in it as well, just to make it a slightly different flavour. Giggle Mug have given us a very different flavour with this musical. Some people are saying that it's not as enjoyable, or it's disappointing is the word I hear. I enjoyed it for what it was, but I can understand that the lack of the flights of fancy and the imagination and the absurdity makes it feel like a very different beast. And actually, if someone said to you, do you want to watch a musical of a tax-related court case, which is another way of describing a show, you might not be so excited. It is the title, ironically, it is the title that's doing all the heavy lifting in selling the show in this case, because we're all intrigued by the idea of a musical based around everyone's, if not favourite biscuit, stroke cake. Then it's something that we've all liked at some stage.
Yeah.
Sweet musk of compost and petrichor, the smell of bonfires on the breeze, a patchwork carpet of reds and browns, pumpkin pie and crunchy leaves. Oh, it's my favourite season, but I can't find a reason to leave the house, let alone my bed. I wanna put my fears behind me, but the autumn leaves remind me of the ghosts that haunt my head. It's so hard to live, but I don't want to die. drown in self-pity, a chicken soup, or don a jumper and a mask. Wish I could step out the front door, stand in the rain, and leave the pandemic in the past. Oh, it's my favorite season, but I can't find a reason to leave the house, let alone my bed. I wanna put my fears behind me, but the dying leaves remind me of the ghosts that haunt my head. It's so hard to live, but I don't want to die. I know I've tried, but I don't want to die. To taste the auburn season, I need to find a reason to leave the house and face the breeze. Can I put my fears behind me and let the autumn sun remind me of the man I want to be?
Well, going from one show that perhaps we felt was constrained by its constraints, for want of a better phrase, one show that I think I found curious, but perhaps could have been a bit more thorough in its dramaturgical reasoning, was the Wellbrick Centre on Roswell Drive.
Oh, a real outlier musical, I call this one. Do you want to describe it briefly before we go further?
I will try. It takes place in kind of a GP mental health centre. We follow...
In Britain.
Yes.
Very British musical.
We follow two main characters, a woman and a man, but really I think we're following the woman primarily. And both of them are going through mental health struggles. And we see hers first.
But different kinds.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they both get assigned a caseworker, a kind of mentor that they check in with. And they both get totally different outcomes as a result of a combination of things. The conditions that they have, the treatment that they receive, their outlook on life, essentially. And am I right in thinking it goes into online consultations, which makes me think that COVID plays a part of this, though it's not really addressed. But that was my assumption of what happened when it turned into online meetings.
You're right. I mean, I didn't really pick up on the significance of COVID being a factor in this, but of course it may well have been. The interesting thing in this, from my point of view, is the question: whose story is it?
Yeah.
And I think that's actually what the whole musical's about, in a strange way. I mean,
there's a very interesting moment where it becomes apparent that it's it feels semi-autobiographical in a way. This lead woman, who is both telling us the story but also in it at the same time, has obviously bandied together a cast of people to play the various people that she remembers from her experience. One of them being the doctor that she...
Who's called Dr. Roswell, as it happens. Even though it's on Roswell Drive, she draws a conspiracy theorist position on this.
Yes.
But it happens that he just has to be called Dr. Roswell.
And about 3/4 of the way through, there is what we perceive to be an audience member who stands up and protests at being portrayed in such a kind of casual, negligent way, and demands that the show be stopped.
And is bundled out by staff.
Yes.
So it's a very odd meta moment, isn't it?
Yes. And actually I was really taken by that, and I thought, in hindsight, that if this show could be set up from the start, that we are let in as it being an autobiographical musical, then that moment would feel even more powerful.
There's a thing I should say here. The actor, and we do think he was an actor because he was waiting around outside, does not join the rest of the cast for the applause at the end of the show. He's bundled out and you don't see him again for all intents and purposes. Yeah. So you are left in the dark about this. For me, I thought it was quite interesting because at the beginning I thought it was the story of the health centre and the patients of Dr. Roswell, who's obviously one of the mental health doctors there. And we see him interacting with, exactly as you say, the two people with significant mental health problems. And they had different mental health problems. So the gentleman, the man, has attempted suicide and has been stopped and has depression and feelings of no self-worth and things like that. And he gets a caseworker with whom he bonds very well, and he starts making slow but steady progress and is ultimately discharged. And we are shown that this has been a very successful process for him. The woman, who's mouthier, I mean that in the fullest sense, she's a much more angry character. Her mental health difficulties make her a less likeable person. And that's quite a big ask for someone who's such an important part of this story. As an audience, she's quite difficult to like. And I didn't like her. I think she's much more aggressive and unpleasant and snarly at people, and she's very unpleasant with her doctor and accuses him of all manner of things. And to begin with, you're thinking, well, that is her illness, and it suggested she's been psychotic. She's had psychotic episodes at various stages. And I thought that we were being encouraged to say, look, mental health difficulties change people. She's not actually behaving in a very nice way, but that is because of the mental health difficulties. And I thought that was quite interesting to try and give us that sense of your natural responses of sympathy or empathy can be affected when people behave speech marks badly, but as in this case, you absolutely know what those reasons are. However, as it went on, she made more and more claims against the doctor of abuse, of more. There was a lot of sort of suggested abuses of care, shall we say. And also the Dr. Roswell character treats her with a certain amount of disdain and dislike. And you think, well, actually, this doesn't seem very professional. This isn't my experience of most doctors, mental health or otherwise, I don't have that breadth of experience, but it goes against what we expect and what we understand a doctor to be like. And so I was thinking, oh, right, okay. I was still taking it at face value at this stage. I just thought it was a straight narrative.
She's kind of becomes an unreliable narrator.
That's exactly it.
No, took the words from you.
No, I'm so glad you said them. And that is the point. That's when you realise, oh my goodness, I think she is the narrator. But actually, this story is still being told through the gauze, shall we say, of mental health difficulties. So you don't know if it's true. Did she imagine these abuses and therefore believes them absolutely, but they didn't happen? Or are they real? And this is a fair representation of what she's seeing. And when are we being told this story? Is it after she's speech marks been found some kind of stability? Or maybe she's not better? Or maybe she is better? Is it in retrospect? Is it as it's happening? And then exactly as you say, we get this point where, and it is a remarkable thing to do. It's still not absolutely clear, but basically a man stands up and says, I am Dr. Roswell, this is a travesty, outrageous, I demand you take it off, and is bundled out. And we don't hear from him again, and they just carry on. So it is a remarkable piece, and yet very low key too. It really, and the music was all folky. It was one person on the guitar, different people at different times. But and that gives you a certain feel, makes it in a small intimate venue as well. It sort of gives you a sense, I think, of the walls closing in slightly as well. That kind of music, when it's one person singing to a guitar about things like that, it felt quite oppressive. I wonder if you have anything else you want to sort of comment on it.
I think I'd lean into that intervention a bit more. I think the way it was handled was very professional, but you actually want to make the aftermath of that moment be imbued with this idea that this has never happened before, this is the first intervention, this isn't something that we've rehearsed, which is a very hard thing to actually
portray.
So I think lean into the unreliable narrator, lean into the kind of the framing device, and then lean into that intervention as well. I think it would make it even more powerful.
And was it the right decision that he, as the actor playing the outraged doctor in the audience rather than the one we see on stage, doesn't join the cast at the end?
Yes.
I agree, but why?
Because I think if he comes up on stage and bows, you undermine the whole point of it.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that we saw him afterwards when we left. He needs to go and have coffee somewhere after he's done that. So
or shout at the audience when they leave. That would leave you in a very...
He could still be there.
Yeah.
That's a really good idea. he could...
This is true! Would be an amazing thing to hear as you left.
Yeah, that's... Anyway.
And I also do want to say that, interestingly, as the narrative is given to us, when it reaches its end, as portrayed on what we're seeing on stage, which by this stage I think most of us have clocked is probably her story, we learn that she's discharged herself from the mental health facility. So she's no longer going to attend, and it's very clear that she's not been assisted, she's not been able to get better.
Yeah.
So she's discharged herself before such support that she's getting, whether that's been good or bad, has been able to help her. Which also then gives you the, oh, well, hang on a minute, then am I being told the story of someone who's still suffering from a great deal of mental health difficulty?
Yeah.
Of quite an extreme nature. Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely, complex place, dressed up as quite a simple show, you know. Yeah. White walls, no set, I mean, 2 or 3 chairs, and a couple of guitars.
And 1 or 2 lanyards.
And a lanyard, yes, absolutely. That's where the expense went. Yes, I'm so glad I saw it. Such a modest piece with such ramifications, I think.
I used to believe in a bright, intrinsic spark that couldn't die. I was chasing a dream of illuminated life. But when I tumbled through that door, I found the sticky carpets and grey walls of the Wellbrick Centre psychiatric ward. Maybe they're right and I need a little vulnerability. I'm terrified to let my walls down, but sick and tired of being bricked in. I don't trust the doctors and their pharmaceutic stabs at mental health. What's the point of hearing voices when the world won't let me talk? Still not sure which one is me in this nails on a chalkboard symphony. But I'm just who I need to be to get my madhouse choir back in key. I'll be the conductor of a life I want to lead, no matter the doctors and their diagnoses. I'm proud of me, proud of me.
And there we are, the second of 2 songs from the Wellbrick Centre on Roswell Drive. And I'm particularly grateful to Greg Van Kerkhoff, who wrote those songs, and Julianne Chorn, the writer, for allowing me to play these 2 songs in the episode. And as I had the pleasure of saying a few weeks ago, if you want to see this show, you actually can, because it's on YouTube in its entirety. It's called the Wellbrick Centre on Roswell Drive, and it's certainly worth a watch. And if you want to find out more about the composer of those songs, that's Greg Van Kerkhoff, go along to his Fiverr page. That's www.fiverr.com/Greg VK Music, all one word. And before that, you heard a conversation about a Jaffa Cake Musical, and there were 2 songs from that show as well. And if you want to find out more about the people behind that, go to gigglemugcomedy.com. It's a fabulous website, and you can also find out more about their other shows. And the songs were written by Sam Cochran and recorded by Rob Gathercole, who also did the arrangements. And before that, there was Crispr, the musical, put on by Surf Rock Media, based in America, in New York in fact. And if you want to find out more about them, you can. Go to surfrock.io, where you can hear a couple of the songs from the show. But even better than that, once again on YouTube you can see the whole show. A recording from September 2023, in fact, but it's the same show that we saw in Edinburgh in the summer of 2024. It's Crispr, CRISPR, the musical, with the obligatory exclamation mark. And that's on the Surf Rock Media page of YouTube. So, rather wonderfully, we have a situation where 2 of the 3 shows that we've spent time talking about today are visible to watch at the time of broadcast of this episode, if you want to do so. So if you didn't get to Edinburgh and would like to see more of these shows, and see if you agree with the comments made by Colm and myself, and indeed with Mike Shapiro a few weeks ago, then you can do so. That's a rather wonderful thing. And that, I think, brings us very neatly to the end of this episode. Don't forget to join us again next week, or whenever, for more of the same. We haven't quite finished our general mop-up of Edinburgh Festival Fringe shows this year. One more episode on that. And then, of course, in the new year, amongst other things, you'll be able to hear interviews with many of the creatives behind some of the shows we've spoken about, and indeed a whole number of shows that we haven't yet touched on. But for the time being, I'm going to bring this whole episode to a shuddering halt with an appropriate lyric written by one half of that famous duo, Rodgers and Hammersmith. So long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Colm Malloy and Thos Ribbits. Edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2024, except for the songs where the copyright remains with the original creators. And my enormous thanks go to them for allowing me to play their wonderful songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on the usual social media networks like Facebook, Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to follow me on the latter, you can. At Musical Talk Thos. Do we want to talk about trends, actually, before we do music now? Should we say...
Go on then.
Okay.
I'll just top this up.
Yeah. Fizz, fizz, fizz. Oh, very nice. I did one interview and champagne cocks, or cocks.
Well,
oh,
corks.
God. Champagne corks were popping in the background. It sounded like we were having a marvellous time. Nothing to do with us.